Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with another project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek radio-controlled King Tiger heavy tank. Since the last video update, the vehicle's tow cable mounts have been added along with the tin work. There's a lot of detail modifications that were needed to get the model up to condition that you see it here, so stay tuned because we're going to be discussing all of that in this video. Well, it's at this point of the build now where I can start adding on the tank's tin work. Now, on the King Tiger, the tin work are actually fastened to these steel straps that are welded to the side armor plates. And on the Armortek here, they actually do it in the, well, in a way that's very similar to the way it is on the real tank. On the Armortek tank here, we have all these little blocks, and these blocks are actually the fender mounts. Now, the units, I believe, are very similar to the ones found on the earlier release King Tigers that they made. Here you can see what the pieces look like. In the center portion here, we have this countersunk well. This is for the actual mounting fastener that secures this strap to the side of the tank. And then we have these other two holes on the top, which are the securing holes for the tin work. Note that these are pre-tapped, so that once these units are fastened to the side of the tank, all you gotta do in order to mount the fender on is fasten the tin work to the plates as it is on the real vehicle. Let me bring the camera around to show what the hull looks like in order to get a good idea on how everything actually works. And with the camera readjusted, you can see the securing holes here on the side of the hull. Note on the tank there are just 3 blind holes that are drilled into the armor plate, and this is exactly how it comes from Armortek. The 2 holes on the top and bottom, it's a good thing that they're blind because once the piece threads on, you don't have to worry about matching the threads, and the mounting fastener for the tin work just goes directly through and don't make contact with the hull in any way, shape, or form. The center hole is also a blind hole, which means in order to affix the plate to the side of the tank, you need to have a corresponding nut on the inside that sandwiches everything together. Well, after a little time with an Allen wrench, I was able to get all of the plates fitted to the side here of the model. They go on relatively easily. Just one thing you have to watch out for is the orientation when you're screwing these components on. You want to make sure that the holes line up with the drilled-in holes that are found on the plate. Otherwise, when it comes time to fit on the fender, it's not going to fit on right. And if the holes are slightly askew, they're going to bottom out on the metal plate as opposed to going in, which can lead to some problems. When it comes time for alignment, I basically just use my eye. I've done this enough times to know how to square them off. But if you want to be more cautious with it, what you can do is you can take 2 M3 fasteners, thread them into the 2 top holes here, or I should say the top hole and the bottom hole, and then when it comes time to fastening it, these 2 fasteners will act as an alignment jig, which will make sure that the piece fits on in a nice square manner. It's one of those tricks that it is doable, but tends to add a little bit more time to your build, and like I said before, I've done this so many times that I basically got good with the eyeballing of the plates for their alignment. But it is something to keep in mind in case you're interested. On the alignment, or I should say on the securement, with the unit here on the front, this threads directly into the plate because this hole is bored directly into the solid aluminum front plate that we have here. So no external fasteners required. You just want to use a slightly shorter fastener so that the piece doesn't bottom out on the inside of the plate, which can cause some complications during the installation. As for the fasteners themselves, on this model here, I did have to make a slight little tweak to the stock kit configuration. You see, as I mentioned before, the kit wants you to utilize a countersunk fastener for the application of these parts. Unfortunately, I had to change this. Not because of any error with the kit or anything. The reason why I had to change it was, fortunately, I don't have any of the countersunk fasteners on hand. More than likely, they either got used on another aspect or on another build, or they probably just got misplaced somewhere in my unkempt shop. Regardless, these pieces still needed to have been fitted to the model. So what I went ahead and did was I switched up the type of fastener from the countersunk to the cap screw. In order to do this, the material on this section over here needs to have been bored out further in order to allow the higher stance of the cap to fit flush. And to do this, this is a tricky procedure. I utilized a drill press vise, and basically I just set the drill press to a certain height so it only removes the necessary amount of material. Why it's risky is because you can easily over drill and go directly through the aluminum piece here, which if that happens, you're actually in pretty big trouble. But I didn't have that problem arise on this model. Now, regardless of using either the cap screw or the countersunk, you are still going to have to do a little bit of body work in order to fully square off this surface over here. This is best done with the Dremel. I already did this procedure to a few of the other fasteners, so let's go ahead and take a look what they look like. And here are the other fasteners I was referring to. Note that they have been thoroughly blended and squared away with the Dremel and a cutting stone in order to give a nice flat surface. From this point here, this is where I'm going to add some bodywork in order just to flare everything in. Keep in mind, on the real King Tiger, this would just be a rectangular plate that's tapped and then would be welded in place. The welds, of course, are going to be added, but this is going to be done with epoxy sculpt and will be done shortly after this scene. However, the pieces still have to have their bodywork done nonetheless, just to blend them in better. Now, although once the tin work gets fitted to the model, you do not see any of these components anymore, but it's one of those procedures that I personally like to do because it does make for a better build in my opinion. Also gives the option for, in case the owner wants to display his tank with a side skirt or two removed, you now can have that option without having any unsightly sections remaining from the fasteners. And this procedure, by the way, needs to be done to boat patterns if you're following the out-of-the-box kit with the original countersunk fasteners, or if you did the modification that I did over here with the replacement of the cap screws. Regardless, you are going to have to plug up these two areas over here. While on the side of the hull, this brings us to the tow cable mounts. Now, these are some of the most important bits of detailing that are found on the side of the King Tiger, and on this model here need to be double important because not only do they act as a bit of detailing, but also need to secure the heavy metal tow cables to the side of the tank. The components that we have strewn out on the table here are what are supplied with the Armortek kit, and by and large, these have stayed pretty much the same from when the Armortek King Tiger was first released back around 2008 or so. So, since that release and the subsequent releases that came afterwards, basically kept the same format in its parts. Now, we'll go over these parts right now. Now, all these parts here are made from CNC aluminum turnings, with the exception of these sections over here, which are laser cut steel. Starting with these parts here, these are the stave and cable mounts. As you can see, they are just a simple CNC aluminum bracket. They have their countersunks present on the pieces, so when it comes time for mounting, you don't have any fasteners which stick up and can cause any inhibitants for the parts that got to get lined up on these sections over here. The little plates, these here are the straps, which are used to secure the equipment which will be fitted to those locations and prevent it from walking around. Over here, in these bags, we have the secondary and tertiary cable mounting locks. The larger ones are going to be used to secure the eyes of the cable mounted to the side of the tank, and these ones here, the slightly smaller ones, are just meant to hold the cable sections that need to bend around the rear portion of the hull, and these secure those two sections in place as well. This is very similar to the Tiger 1, only on the Tiger 1, those were mounted on the top flat portions of the deck, and the engine, or I should say the fan guards or the fan cooling grills, while on the King Tiger, they're mounted vertically on the side of the hull. You have, as for the brackets, you can see how they're all machined out. The turnings, or I should say the machining, is quite good, and these pieces make a good base to start from in order to start the detail work that gets added to them. The pieces are properly hinged with these little sections over here. Everything is all pre-drilled out, including their hinge and fastener locations. And again, will be the basis that I'm going to add upon in order to improve the pieces further. Okay, the first bit of equipment that we're going to tackle are the tow cable and cleaning stave mounts. On the Armortek piece, you'll see that the unit is just a squared off bit of turning. Now, on the real unit, it would just be like on the Tiger 1, where you would have scallops found these sections over here to properly index the cables on the ends and then the cleaning staves in the center. Then that securing plate anchors everything in place and prevents them from walking around. On the Armortek one, you'll notice again, those details here are missing. Another bit of detailing that is found on the real units is that on one of these block sections over here, there is a pivoting fastener that can move out of the way, which would allow better access or removal of the securing plate, which goes on the top and keeps everything anchored where it needs to be. On the securing plates themselves, like I showed before, this section here has its material removed in order for it to swivel out of the way, which makes installation a little bit easier. However, on the real vehicle, it was actually just oddly enough, a simplistic plate where you just have a long rectangular plate with two standard holes that are drilled in. So because of that, both of these units here will not be used on this build and will just be set aside. In their place, I'll be utilizing these two resin components that I have here. These resin pieces are the EastCoastArmory.com Tiger 1 tow cable and stave mounts. These units here are actually on their way out. They're getting kind of old now with the molds, but for this build here, they're more than suffice. In the future, I'm probably going to be replacing these with 3D printed counterparts, but more information on that is to be posted on the Facebook page. However, for this build here, like I said, the resin ones are going to be utilized in their place. Note on these units, they do have the scallops that index the cables and the cleaning staves. What is missing on these older sets are the little detail here for the pivoting fastener, but this is something that I'm going to machine into these pieces once they progress past this raw casted point that I have here. And the reason why I can't recycle those pivoting plates was, one, because that little bit of material that was removed, and also you'll notice that they are a lot thinner compared to the ECA one. So because of that, I'm just going to start fresh and replace them with a brand new piece of strip brass. That will be of the appropriate width. Now, on my past King Tiger build, I actually went ahead and modified and reused the kit one, but in order to do that, I actually took my resin one here, made some modifications where I amputated the other sections, kept the centers, and just mounted them directly to the block. And I was actually going to do this on this one here, but then I realized, why? It's kind of really unnecessary when I could just swap them out entirely and just use the resin ones. The resin ones are more than suffice at the job at hand, because with the way the fasteners are actually holding everything in place, the fasteners are not going to be threaded or connected to the resin pieces in any way. In fact, the fasteners are going to be on the inside portion of the armor plate. So when everything gets anchored in place, the resin piece here is really nothing more than just a spacer or a washer. So that's why they're able to work on even the other Armortek builds that I've done, namely Tiger 1s that have been posted on this channel in the past. So these guys here are going to enter into full production now, where I'm going ahead and machine out all this extra flash from the casting and then clean them up in order to get them ready for installation. The next bits to talk about are the tow cable eye mounts. Now let me go ahead and open up the little baggie here. Okay, now that the parts have been debagged, the pieces now come into better view. You can see that on the Armortek piece, it's just a simple L bracket. And there's nothing in this section over here. On the Armortek kit, basically the fastener goes through the side hull, protrudes from this section. This is where you can secure everything in place, and this is actually a really good design. It's nice and strong, and you don't have to worry about the piece ever breaking on you. But on the real tank, it's slightly different in its overall geometry. There is actually a squared off section that emerges from this point here, and this is where the plate rests upon it, and is where the wing nut then secures everything in place. And just like with the tow cable mounts, the piece actually can pivot out of the way in order for the piece to hinge properly. The hinge work is actually also going to be kept, but the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this little section over here with a Dremel, which will give you the appropriate slot required for the piece to pivot open. Now, on this section here where it's missing, I'm actually going to fabricate this missing bit of detailing, and the way I'm going to do that is by recycling again my Tiger 1 tow cable eye set. Only I'm not going to utilize the whole piece unlike the other sections, because on the King Tiger, this portion here is a different geometry and shape and resembles more of this unit that we have here. But what I am going to recycle from this section is this portion over here. I'm going to simply just amputate this from the other casting, discard that, and this piece here is going to be drilled out and is going to sleeve over the fastener that protrudes from the hull. This will give you the appropriate detailing that is found on this component, and it'll also retain all of the strength and structure support of the piece being made from aluminum. So it's really the best of both worlds, with their modifications made and are ready for installation. On the cable and stave mounts, I need to run out to the hobby shop after filming this scene and get the brass, and with any luck, hopefully I'll be able to be let into the building. But Regardless, these pieces here will have their straps fabricated, and then they'll be able to be fastened to the vehicle as well. But on these portions over here, this is where the majority of the mods really have been made. On the tow cable eye mounts, first and foremost, just like with some of the other parts which come out of a CNC machine, there are some burrs to deal with, namely in this section over here. It was just a little bit of material that was left from the milling process, which inhibited the little hinge plate from getting in there and being able to function properly. So with the straight edge needle file, just some passes were all that was required in order to hand fit it to get it to fit in a nice fluid motion. As you can see, it fits right in there, nice and good. Some of the other mods I made was I drilled out these two holes over here. The kit utilized, I believe, M2.5 fasteners for these two locations, but I generally like to use M3 because of the added strength, and also I have just more of an abundance of these type of fasteners lying around the shop, so they're going to be substituted with those in place. On the securing plate, you'll notice I went ahead and cut out the little strap that was in this section over here. You could see it in the image that's popping up over there in the corner of just how this was done. It was a quick little procedure. All that was required was a Dremel with a cutting disc and just a couple little passes, and the pieces were removed. And that was really all that's required to get this guy ready for final assembly. On the bottom here, we can see the resin pieces now fully prepared for mounting onto the component. These were the same ones that I mentioned before. The remainder of the tow cable eye mount was amputated off. The piece was drilled, and I also machined this little inset into these sections over here, which will give you the illusion that the piece can't actually pivot, when in actuality it's just not. It's just the fastener coming through, but it gives you the illusion that the piece is fully functional, as it should be. On these components here, all that was done was I went ahead and deburred them with the mill, drilled the two sections out, and on this portion over here you can see I did the exact same modification with the square end mill, giving the little inset here which is present on the real unit. What I am going to do after the filming of the scene, besides running out to the hobby shop, is take a drill or a drill bit and put two little divots on each of these sections on both the stave mounts as well as on these little blocks here, to give again the illusion that there is a locking pin which holds everything in place. But from here, let's go ahead and get these guys mounted to the model. When it comes time to mounting the units to the hull, I'm of course going to start with the stave mounts that I mentioned before. Now, also what was seen, the new stave mounts, the mounting fasteners are going to be in a very different location compared to the old ones. The old ones are in the center, the new ones are going to be on the ends. Well, since the kit was designed for the ones in the center, new holes are going to have to be drilled. In order to properly index and line everything up, you'll notice that I went ahead and did several marks on the side of the hull here with a pencil and a square, just to make sure everything is where it needs to be. I even used the original kit one here in order to give me the proper height indexing where they go, and simple because of the holes. I just line them up, and that gives me my horizontal points, to which then the rest one can line up, and now I know exactly where the holes gotta go. So these are going to be center punched and drilled. Now, another trick I'm going to do is, besides just drilling the holes out and having the fasteners stick out from the side of the hull, you need to do something else besides that, or else the fasteners will just run the opportunity of sliding into the hull when it comes time for final assembly and installation. This can happen if you just glue them in place. The glues will hold them for the most part, but you run the risk of, when it comes time to putting the straps on with the fasteners, the extra layers of paint will possibly slow down or grab onto the nut, and then it'll just break the glue bonds, which then now you have to reach inside the tank in order to tighten the fasteners. It's really less than ideal. In order to prevent that, you have really one of two options. Option number one is to just drill and tap the holes, which is probably one of the easier methods to do, and once that's done, you're not going to have to worry about the units ever falling in. Another option is to, once you drill out the hole for the center fastener, you also drill out a wider hole on this top partially in for the use of a nut. This has been mentioned on a few of my other videos with some other I believe procedures that I've done, and basically you're going to thread the piece into the plate, the nut holds it in. The nut then gets submerged under the new bracket once it gets fitted, so the fastener is held firmly in place and ain't gonna go nowhere. That's another method that can be used, and that one, both these methods have their pros and cons. Pro for the tapping system is that it is, albeit a little bit easier, because all you're doing is drilling and then just tapping the unit in place, but the downside of that is you run the risk of possibly the tap snapping on you when it comes to the cutting the threads, and then you have some other complications to deal with. And it's also pretty laborious where you have to go in, turn, back out, turn, oil, back out. It can get a little tedious on that end. But the other end requires you to do a little bit more drilling, and then you have to make sure the depths are set. So again, each procedure comes with their pros and cons, and whichever method you use, it's really up to your discretion as the builder. But both of them will basically give you to the exact same end result. Okay, so here you can see that the stave mounts have now been mounted to the side of the hull. And for the application, I went with the ladder approach, like I mentioned before, where I counter bore out a section of the metal for the use of a nut. And for me, I went with this application because it's just easier for the type of tools that I have right here on hand. Now, if anyone's wondering, you're going to say, well, John, you do have some of the nut exposed on this portion over here. Well, keep in mind, this isn't going to be there for long, because soon after I install all these components, I'm going to go ahead and add a layer of sculpted epoxy weld beads around all these locations. And once those get added, these exposed areas here are no longer going to be visible. You can also notice that I went with really long fasteners for this approach. Now, these are definitely longer than they need to be. I went with the longer approach because, one, these were really some of the only fasteners I had on hand that were long enough to get through the armor plate. But also I left them long on purpose because when it comes time to fitting on the tow cables, I'm going to adjust the heights of these so that they're going to be the perfect height required in order for these parts here to be fitted properly. So this just gives me a little bit of an insurance policy. These will be trimmed once all of the components are fitted, and then I could go ahead and test the tow cable on to see if everything works the way it should. Now, some people might also notice that I had to take a Dremel and remove some sections of the nut which were protruding from the model surface. This was probably had to do with the way the fastener was threaded on. Due to the angle here of the side armor plate in combination with the way the sponson is found on the inside, it is extremely difficult to get a tool on the inside here in order to hold everything in place so I could thread the nut and tighten it into its final location. I was able to get it basically all the way there, but just that little bit of material that was sticking up from the surface, which was easily removed with the Dremel. With the piece removed, you can see that the fasteners are absolutely stiff and they're not going anywhere. So with this one out of the way, time to progress on the others. Alright, and here we have the tow cable mount now secured to the vehicle. Just like with the other unit, I went ahead and utilized a sunken nut type procedure for permanently affixing this threaded section to the side armor hull. And for the one in the center, I just use a countersunk Phillips screw. Once the tow cables get fitted on, this unit here is going to be completely covered up and it's not going to be visible anymore. All that's remaining is to add the hinge plate on this, but this will be done after I secure the other tow cable mount to the side of the vehicle. On the model here, this hole was present on the armor plate, which is why I went ahead and fitted it, but the other one here, I believe I might have to slightly alter the mounting configuration found on the stock kit. In order to do this, however, I'm going to need to rig up the tow cable to see exactly where the piece needs to go. This is the best way to assure that there are no surprises when it comes time for fitting on the tow cable at the tail end of the build. Here we have the kit supply cable. Just like what was mentioned in a few other Armortek builds, the Armortek kit supplies you with a pre-made steel cable, and it's cut to the appropriate length and has its tow cable eyes already pre-fastened. The pieces here are very nicely done, so well in fact that literally it's not really necessary to replace these with an aftermarket source, so that saves a little bit on the construction end as well as your budget end as well. The mounts, I'm just going to line them up right here. Now it's a little cumbersome to work with this cable because it kind of has a mind of its own, but luckily with the way the mounts are, everything should be able to be wrangled in order for you to get a really good idea on where everything needs to go. These two holes here in the back, let me move the camera. These two holes here in the back are where the cable locks are going to be fitted, and they're going to go in that type of a motion. So with that here, I can now double check. Bring the camera to the front. Okay. And then from here, I can go ahead and double check to see exactly where this guy here needs to go. Once I have the appropriate location, I can mark it and then just do the exact same procedure I did over here, but for this unit. Once the hinge plates are on, it's then time to trim off the remainder of the threaded rod. Now, you'll notice I went ahead and added a nut to these sections over here, and this was done on purpose. You see, when you amputate a section of threaded rod or a bolt or whatever, a lot of times you'll have a burr that, of course, remains from the cutting procedure, and this can make reinsertion of the nuts very difficult. So what I do is I actually thread a nut onto the place where it's out of the way. I then amputate the section of the threaded rod, and then once the unit is removed, I back the nut out. When you back and remove the nut, this in turn actually retaps this section here where the piece was cut off, and then it allows you to re-add the fasteners without any sort of problems. You'll notice I went ahead and I marked the amount of material that needs to be removed, and then from here with a Dremel with a cutting stone, I'm going to go ahead and do the procedure. Okay, now that the pieces are removed, with a wrench over here, I'm going to go ahead and remove the nut. When you unthread the nut, you want to go back and forth on the section of threaded rod that was just cut, which will help with rethreading of the part. Okay, let's go ahead and take the fastener out and do it to the opposite one now. Out it goes. Okay. Now to test to see if it works with a nut, I'm just going to go ahead and thread it directly where it needs to be. And voila, it works absolutely perfectly. After the rear tow cable mounts are added, the remainder of the weld beads have been added to all of the added details that I just mentioned. Let me go ahead and bring the camera in closer to get a good idea on what the pieces look like now completed. And with the camera now closer, you can see the rear tow cable mounts in better detailing. For the base tow cable mounts themselves, I recycled the ECA Resin Tiger 1 tow cable mounts, but I added some tweaks to them to better make them fit for a King Tiger. By using this method, this gives you the illusion that the piece can hinge out of the way, but still retains all of its structural strength. On this section over here, you'll notice that I added a small little spacer, and this spacer is present on the real King Tiger examples that I was studying. In order to replicate the spacer, this is nothing more than an aluminum tube that was marked to length and then cut and fitted to the threaded rod. Now for the mounting procedure, I did have to slightly modify the stock Armortek kit. On the one on the top, one of the holes was present with the Armortek side plate drillings, while the other one was just simply drilled and bored out for the use of the nut. On the bottom one here, I actually had to re-drill both of the holes. The stock one was in the middle center right over here, but when it came to mounting this component in place, it just didn't really fit right with either one of the kit supplied holes, so I just went ahead and crunched some numbers and added 2 new holes in their appropriate locations. Once the pieces were fitted, the sculpted weld beads were added, thus concealing all of the other work that was mentioned before. And the welds concealing the fastener modifications is more appreciated on the stave mounts, as we recall before, there was a small little section on the top and the bottom that was still visible of the bored out hole and the securing nut. And just like I said before, once the sculpted welds go on, that's no longer going to be evident. And needless to say, on the reverse side of the vehicle, the work is a mirror image. However, one thing I do want to point out is that you do see some other mounting holes found here on the stock kit side panel, and this would be for the track removal cable, which is also supplied with the model. However, unlike the main toe cable mounts where I recycle many of the kit parts, for the track removal cable that's not going to be the case. Instead, I actually tooled up an entire set for this detailing, which is in 3D print. At the moment of filming this, those are in production, and once in hand, I'll be able to secure them to the model, which more than likely will be the topic in the next video update. Same can also be said about the remainder of the Pioneer tool mounts that are required in order to finish off the side hull detailing. Now, on the mounts themselves, all the bodywork has been completed and they have been sanded down. In addition to that, during the bodywork phase, some of the body filler, or the red putty I should say, got into the threads that secure the fasteners in place. And this is something that can easily happen if you're doing this procedure on this build. What I did to clean them out, it's very simple. I took my M3 tap that I have, and I just threaded right into these sections here. Since the tap are the exact same threads as the ones that are pre-tapped into this plate, you're not going to damage the threads, and it's just going to index appropriately. But once you're screwing it in, all the gunk putty that's in these sections here are either going to fall out of the back, or with those flutes on the tap are going to get moved and pushed into those recesses and shoved out of the way, which will then in turn clean out the holes for you, allowing you to properly put in your fasteners. Well, with the side skirt mounts out of the way, the next logical step is, of course, the remainder of the tin work. Now, on the Armortek kits, all of the tin work are comprising of the components that we have here on the table, with maybe the exception of some of the hinge work required on the mud flaps, but I'll get into that once I crack it open to see for certain. The tin work on the Armortek King Tiger is actually one of the best parts of the kit because they really did a nice job with rendering out these components. All of the tin work panels supply you with all the components required in order to assemble the tin work, and they are all comprised of laser cut metal, sheet steel specifically. You can see they are pre-bent, pre-shaped, and they have their holes already included on the pieces. Also note that the Armortek kit has the holes with their appropriate hole geometry, where we have like a key mod type format. This is just like as per the real vehicles, because on the real vehicle you actually align the side skirts where they need to go and then drop them in place, and then they hang on the fasteners, which then of course you could tighten to secure them further. The pieces of course are a mirror image, which is going to be necessary in order to properly equip the vehicle. Now, some of the panels you'll notice have these small little holes that are found on the sides. These holes here are for the other bits of equipment that get added to these fenders, or side skirts I should say. And if you look at a real King Tiger, you'll see that the panels that are on the outer layer have these guides that are fitted, or I think they're stamped into the metal fender. It could be a little hazy on that, but anyway, there are these pieces that extend out from some of the panel work, and they just help to clamp everything together and make it as seamless as possible. And on the Armortek kit, those pieces are supplied, and they are supplied in this form of brass photo etch. You'll notice that the photo etch does have some holes that correspond to the ones found here on the Fender work, and basically you're going to have to snip all of these off and bend them to shape in order to have them fit onto the panel work. So if anyone is used to working with small, like 1/35 scale type PE, this over here should look very familiar to you. Along with the side skirt tim work, the kit also supplies you with the front and rear mud flaps. And of course, there's going to be a left and right hand specific version for both of these units. The mud flaps, as well as the remainder of the tim work, came with the grease paper that we have here, which does do a very good job in preventing any, or mitigating, I should say, any sort of surface rust that can possibly emerge. So, this is still factory sealed, by the way, so we're going to open this up and share the moment together in this video right now. All right. These here are, yep, looks like both rear and front mud flaps. I'll get to these in a second. These here are the two front sections. Note they are pre-cut, pre-bent with their appropriate circumference, and the hinge work is already pre-stamped in, which is a nice feature that this has. In addition to the main flap, we have here the extender component, which plugs and connects to the remainder of the tin work, which is one of the more iconic features on the King Tiger. These pieces here obviously come pre-assembled and done by Armortek, and this was true for the other variants of the King Tiger that were released in the past as well. I don't believe I had to solder or assemble these pieces. They came in this pre-assembled configuration. Now, like what we just saw before, these are two separate components and are welded in place, so you don't have to worry about any sort of solder joints undoing themselves or maybe even rusting out on you. These pieces here are very nicely done and should last you basically for the lifetime of the model. You can see the quality of the welds. Again, just really good high quality type features. On the brackets here, you know, they are pre-stamped and bent to appropriately fit onto their main fender work. Moving down deeper takes us to the two main rear mud flaps. And it appears that these are just the main halves. There is a hinge section which emerges from this portion over here, just like you would find on a Tiger 1. And more than likely these are with the other parts in the parts bins, which are ever depleting as the build is progressing, which is always a good feeling. But just like with the front sections, they are made from the same type of gauge sheet steel. They are pre-bent and stamped, and the hinge work is integral to the piece, which is a nice feature. And here are the side skirts going through their assembly. On this section here, we have two of the skirts with their PE strips added, and on this side here they're still going through their process, or I haven't really started yet. The PE goes on without any problems. They are appropriately sized and shaped and really just bend directly in place. I did slightly deviate, however, from the kit with the way the straps are mounted to the steel. You see, if you look at the steel plate, you'll notice that there are some small little holes found in these sections over here. And there are corresponding holes found on the photo etch. The way the kit is designed is that you have some supplied brass or copper fasteners, namely rivets, that gets crushed into these locations here, and they, along with possibly some adhesive, are what's used or what's recommended to keep these units in place. Rather than using this approach, I went with my normal type of adherence for these type of pieces, which is the use of solder. By soldering the pieces in place, this gives you some very good bonds, and it gives you some really good bodywork where you don't really have a seam present anymore. I believe on the real units these may be stamped, if I'm not mistaken, and you don't have any of those little fasteners to contend with. Now, if anyone's wondering exactly how do I do this procedure, well, let me go ahead and walk you through the steps right now. The first thing I want to talk about is the removal of the photo etch from the sprue itself. This sprue, as you can see, does not have any sort of numbers or other identification features found to distinguish which one of these pieces go on which side skirt. It is labeled, however, in the instructions, but it's just not on the sprue itself, as you would find on more traditional, smaller scale PE sets that are out there. But that's not really that much of a problem. You see, these pieces here, these panels, are specific for each of these parts, so mixing them up is quite difficult. But in order to just save some time and to prevent any sort of headaches, what I like to do is I like to take these pieces off individually and use them prior to removal of any other strips. This way, you only have one strip to worry about, and once this is mounted to the side or to the tin work here, then you could just free another one off the sprue, and it prevents any sort of confusion. In order to bend the parts, I have this small little set of pliers over here. It doesn't really take a really strong set of pliers to do the job. A needle nose will easily do the same type of procedure. When it comes to the holes, they do line up absolutely perfectly with each other, which is a good indicator to help you figure out which one of these pieces goes to which set. The next thing you got to look for is exactly which side of the holes line up with the plate. If you notice, on the brass strip here, you have a small little hole that would be for the rivet, and it's off-centered. And this is exactly how you want to position it onto the plate. The holes on the plate do line up absolutely perfectly well with the ones here on the strip, which is a great way to help you align it. And if you look, this is how I was able to align the parts. Just like that. So when it comes time for installation, this is exactly how you do it. From this point here, by holding the strip in place, make sure that the holes line up, I just simply bend the top portion over with my finger, and then I just bend it on the secondary location where it needs to be. Now that I have my rough shape, I'm just going to tweak it ever so slightly. And I can use a plier over here just to make sure that the bend in the brass is where it needs to go. Okay, just some fiddling. Now that the piece is pre-bent to shape, the next modification, or I should say next step in the procedure, is to prep the surface of the steel in order to add the solder. You see, if anyone has ever tried to do a lot of soldering before, you'll know that soldering to steel, specifically sheet steel like this, is doable, but it's not necessarily the most easiest thing to do. You have to do some prep work to the plate itself. Now, just like what's very similar done with welding, what I'm going to do is I'm going to abrase these sections over here with a Dremel with a cutting disc on it, which is similar to what you see a lot of people do to plates before they weld them together, and it's really kind of for the same reason. So with the Dremel and the cutting disc, I'm just going to go ahead and randomly add some scuffs to these locations over here. And it'll look something like this. Okay, and after the Dremel's done, this is the type of look you want to have going for you. From here, I can just set the panel here on top of the vise, and that now leads us to the soldering. For the soldering, you're going to need 3 components. First is a spool of solder. For the solder, I'm actually using a 6040 electrical solder for this, rosin core, I believe. A tub of soldering flux, very, very important. And the third, and probably one of the equally most important things, is a soldering iron. For the soldering iron, you want to have something that is really powerful. A standard small type circuit board soldering iron is not going to be enough to do this job. Because of the thickness of the plate that we have here and the size of the plate, if you have a small soldering iron, this entire metal plate is going to soak up that heat, act as a giant heat sink, and it's going to prevent the solder from flowing smoothly. So you want to really have a nicely powered one. This soldering iron here is a relatively recent purchase. I bought it a few months ago, and so far, knock on wood, has been doing the job pretty well. The link for this I purchased off of Amazon, and it's found in the video description. Once the iron is fully heated up, which you can see just by that quick little test, it is now time for me to tack the part in place and then go through the soldering. With the flux, I'm just going to go ahead and smear it onto this section over here. You could use your finger, but if you don't want to get this nasty stuff on your finger, a stick of some flavor or another will be perfectly suffice. Okay, now that's on. With this, got some crud in here. All right. Yeah, you don't want to have any foreign particulate because that could just lead to issues. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the hole on the bottom. With the iron, I'm going to get some solder on it. And just basically tack the unit in place. Once it cools off, the piece is now tacked on. Then I'm going to tack it again along the top portion. Make sure that the holes are lining up. There we go. Tack it across up on the top portion so that the holes are, so the alignment is right, and then I can just go through the remainder of the strip. Okay, once the piece is tacked in place, it's then time to go through and solder the entire strip to the plate. Now, for this is why you need this type of an attachment here on the drill, or the drill press, on the soldering iron. Oop, there we go. It's the screwdriver type setup, which means that I could just run directly across the seam over here, and the heat will just have the solder flow directly where it needs to be. Might want to add a little more flux for this, just for good measure. All right, and let's go ahead and start applying the solder. By the way, I also want to add, it's a lot trickier to do it on screen or on camera as it is when I'm just doing it on my own. So, I'll throw that out there. But there you can see how the solder just flows directly where it needs to be. See, just like that. That is what you're looking for. Add a little gap over here, and go ahead and fill that in with a little more solder. Perfect. Okay, now that the main strips are done, I need to take care of the last bit strip here and then the top portion. Before I solder the strip here, I'm actually going to bend the top, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to grab the plier, and I'm just going to basically use it as a brake. So I'm going to hold it and just move along, keeping pressure on it, and there we go. The brass has bent where it needs to go. Note the holes are lined up, which is exactly what you want. Add a little more flux. Alright, now let's go ahead and finish this section up. Make sure it's bent nice and flat to the top, and this should just finish this guy right off. And boom. Okay, so now that the piece is affixed to the plate, the next thing to worry about, or take care of I should say, are the holes that are found on the brass. For this, I'm just going to take just a blop of flux, put them in each of the holes, and then with the iron, I'm just going to melt a little bit of solder in there. It's going to make a little circle on top, which will in turn fill in the hole, which will look something like this. Now, the way I like to do is I like to take the corner of the iron, put it into the hole, and then add the solder, and it will just melt and flow into where it needs to be. So, you want to hold it until you want to let the piece heat up. You're going to see the surface bubble up and smoke, and then even residual solder will start flowing in. But from here, add a little drop, boom, there you go. That's all you want to do. Same thing to this guy. Just let it heat up, sizzling, boom, all set. Might as well show it on this side too. And that's it. That's all she wrote. For soldering, that is. So now the plate, or I should say the strip, is permanently fixed to the tin work, and the holes have been plugged up, but you're not done yet. The next step is to polish all the extra solder away, leaving for a nice, smooth appearance. Before I could go ahead and do that, however, I just want to wipe down the surface with a little bit of mineral spirit or paint thinner, just to help get the flux off. The flux I'm using is soluble for paint thinner, so it's not water soluble flux. They do have that out there specifically if you're using plumbing solder. For this one here, I don't like particularly using water soluble because obviously sheet steel and water, or I should say bare sheet steel and water, not the best match that you can think of. So with the mineral spirits, it tends to mitigate a lot of surface rust which can form. Of course, once the pieces are done, they're going to go directly into primer, which will seal the metal off, thus giving a layer of protection, preventing it from surface rust. To do the bodywork, I'm going to utilize my palm sander that I have here. The sandpaper on is 220 grit, and what's nice about this type of a unit is that I could just cut squares of sandpaper and mount it in these locations over here, because you will burn through sandpaper pads fairly quickly. So this one here did the other two side skirts I showed before, so it's kind of on its last leg. Hopefully it'll be enough to do the job at hand. So let's go ahead and fire it up. As you can see, the unit is doing its job. The pad, though, is going to need to be replaced. And to help further it along further, on these sections over here where we do have quite a bit of solder that's pulled up, I'm going to use here this fine file just to polish away some extra material, which will give the other guy a little bit of a head start. So just a few passes. Okay, so let me go ahead and switch out the pad and then progress with a fresh one. And there we have it. You see, with the fresh pad on, it made a much shorter work of the extra solder that was on the surface. And from here, basically, I gotta do the exact same steps to the opposite side. So let me cut across to when these pieces are all done. Well, once the last of the photo etch straps are added to the tin work, the units go directly into primer. Now that the pieces are primed, they should be protected from any sort of surface rust that may have emerged otherwise. And from here, they're ready for, well, installation. One aspect of the tin work, however, I want to point out, and it's actually one that kind of took me off guard the first time I did a Armortek King Tiger was with the installation of the tin work. You see, unlike a Tiger 1 where the sections all go on basically in a row and they don't really make contact with each other, the King Tiger here is a slightly different animal. And this is specifically true for anyone who's ever modeled the King Tiger in smaller scales. See, generally when you assemble the side skirt panels on something like a 135 or a 172, the side skirts are rendered basically in two different formats. Either they are integrally molded to the upper hull and are one complete piece, or they're a separate component that needs to be glued on, but are generally rendered in one complete section that again gets fastened to the hull in that manner. Well, on the real King Tiger, that's not really the case when it comes with the installation. And what I'm referring to is with the order that the panels get fitted. You see, there is a certain order on how the panels do get mounted on. And it's something that you have to do in sequence. Why this is important on the Armortek is you can't just start from the front or the rear and just put them all in a row until you get to the tail end. The side skirts are not going to go on in that manner. And that is because of these sections over here with the built-up flange that we soldered together earlier. You see, if you try to put these on just in sequential order like that, these type of sections are not going to be able to fit properly onto the sections with the flange. The way this has to work is you first install the panels that are flangeless to the vehicle. So it's every other section. Once those are installed, you then add on the flanged units, and that will finish off the installation. Again, it's one of those little quirks that you don't really appreciate or realize are on this vehicle until you do something in this type of format. The way I like to install the panels is with going from the front and moving my way to the back. You can obviously do this in reverse, but as long as you mount the appropriate fenders where they need to be. So I'll start with this one. Well, with this panel out of the way, the next one's going to be mounted over here because, like I said before, it's every other panel that needs to be mounted with the first layer. When it comes for fitting the panels, on the King Tiger, it's basically a puzzle of sorts. You kind of have to find which corresponding panel goes in its location. Now, luckily, with the King Tiger, they do have a format to their shape, and once fitted, they have this continuous line to them. So putting the wrong panel in the incorrect location is definitely going to be something that you're going to quickly notice. So, sort of like, again, best way to put it, like a puzzle. Here we go. And this one's next. Note, it's wider in the front as it is compared to the rear. This is exactly what you're looking for this panel here. I'm just going to fit it in place and then secure it with the fasteners. Alright, let's continue. Now, unlike the ones in the front, the rear panel is the only section that actually get 3 connecting blocks that connect to it. And also, unlike the ones on the front, the last one in the rear only gets 1 fastener as opposed to the others, which receive 2. Now, for anyone who has a keen eye, you'll notice that I use a shorter fastener for the one back here. For these two, as well as the other ones that I use, with the exception for the one on the front, I use M3x16s. However, when it comes time to final assembly, I'm more than likely going to switch these out to M3x12s because the 16mm length is really not necessary to secure these pieces to the vehicle. The ones, however, here on the very rear, as well as the 2 that are in the front that get mounted to that really thick front plate, I'm using shorter fasteners because on those 2 sections here, the hole is on the back here, it's completely blind. It doesn't really go through to the other side, and with the ones on the front, it doesn't really go that far into the metal plate. So if you use a longer fastener, you just run the risk of stripping it out or possibly snapping the bolt, which is not really something you want to do. Now, if anyone is concerned with, will this shorter fastener here be strong enough to secure this component to the radio control tank, you have to keep in mind that the one in the rear here is really more or less for show, as the majority of the weight and the structure is being supported by these two here on the front. Alright, well, we have the first 3 panels affixed to the vehicle, which means to finish it off we just need to mount on the last 2. And I also want to point out that at this point here the vehicle does look a bit odd. It's not common to see a King Tiger in this type of format. Generally, when we imagine a King Tiger, it's in one of 3 flavors. We either have it with no skirts on at all the skirts on, or with 1 or 2 skirts removed for artistic effect. But with this type of missing tooth format, it's just a little off-putting. So let's go ahead and add the final 2 fenders on, and you'll see how it all fleshes out. Now that's looking more appropriate, isn't it? Okay, so last fender goes here, and I also want to point out one final thing. You really get to appreciate the design of these mounting straps that Armortek has been added, not just to their King Tigers, but also for their Tiger ones for the last number of years. In the past, in order for you to fit on the tin work on the first generation Tiger ones, you actually have to go in here with a nut, hold it in place while you fasten on the other end. This is definitely something that's less than ideal. With this format, you just screw it directly to the vehicle, and it's just like mounting it on the real one. Also, like I was mentioning earlier in the video, in case you want to display your vehicle with 1 or 2 of these panels off, all you need is a small little ratchet like this, and you're free to do so. With the welding and detailing work that I added earlier, this allows you to display the vehicle in this type of format. So, food for thought to the customer. And there we have it. The King Tiger is now fully skirted. With the skirts on, you can see that they have a very realistic type appearance to them. They shift and have certain little quirks and bends to them, which is exactly what you're looking for on tin work like this. The real vehicles are really no different. So from here, I'm going to repeat all the steps I just mentioned, but on the opposite side, which there's no point really showing because obviously it's the same exact procedures that I just described. Well, clearly with the tin work now mounted to both sides, the vehicle is beginning to flesh out into a proper King Tiger. So the next bit of detailing to progress this further, of course, will be the front and rear mud flaps. However, that information is best set aside for the next project update video, which is a perfect place to end this video. And I hope you all like this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio controlled Armortek King Tiger heavy tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this fellow over here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that frequently get posted to this channel. Finally, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Till next time, everyone. Thank you.